Hello, everybody. So my name's Tim Graves. I'm part of Oracle's Europe-wide Cloud Native Solutions team. What I'm going to be doing today is showing you a little bit about a technology we have called Helidon. Now, we're going to be using a virtual machine here running in the Oracle Cloud, and I've installed into that virtual machine Java, some build tools like Maven, and the Eclipse development environment. Now, everything we're going to see here today is something that is based on a pre-existing lab. So if you'd like to go through this in more detail, we'll provide the link to that at the end of the session. So first of all, what we're going to look at is a little bit about how we would REST enable an existing class. So the idea here is we're going to take existing code and just using Helidon annotations, make it REST enabled. Now, in these projects, these are template projects. I have already set up the pom.xml file, which is the Maven configuration, to import the relevant dependencies for us. So what we're going to have a look at is our storefront project. Now, the storefront is the first of two microservices that we're going to be building here. The storefront is a very simple piece of business logic. The other microservice, which is the stock manager, will communicate with a Oracle backend database to actually hold the data. So we're going to look at our code initially. So here we have our storefront code. This is just standard Java. There's nothing particularly complicated about it. I'm using a couple of features from a software product called Lombok, really just to speed things up. So that's what you'll see these annotations, SLF4J and noargs constructor. It just basically tells Lombok to create a constructor with no arguments for us automatically and to create a logging engine for us. So Lombok is really just a quick pre-processing annotation thing. It's really, really useful if you're doing this kind of stuff because you can have it do things like generate getters and setters and a whole bunch of other stuff for you. Just saves time. And it also means that as you make changes to your code, those are automatically updated as well. So first of all, we need to tell Helidon as a framework, but this is something we even want to make available as a REST resource. Okay, so there's a couple of annotations we need to put on here. First of all, it's an annotation called path. And this is basically the URL path that this piece of code will respond to. Now, as we'll see later, there's actually a little bit of a hierarchy here because you've got the application, you have classes within the application, or resources within the application, and then you have individual methods within that, and each of those can effectively add something to the beginning of the path. But what we're going to do here is we're just going to call it /store. Okay, nice, simple, standard Java annotations, and we're going to tell it it's request scoped. Okay, what this means, oops, helps if I spell request right. What this means is that it is going to create one instance of this class for every single request. Okay, the beauty of that means that I don't have to worry about things like setting up multi-threaded to process across requests and so on. There are other types of scope that we'll see later on. Okay, so nice and simple. Our class now has, I will respond to /store and Helidon will create a new instance for us automatically. So we're going to have a look here at the actual method to implement, and we're going to look at the list all stock method. What this is doing, you'll notice it just literally returns a collection of items or stock items. A stock item is a very simple piece of code, and okay, I can't remember where it's defined. Is it up here? Yeah. So stock item really is just a couple of values, a string and a name. There's a bunch of other annotations on here that are open API annotations that will enable Helidon to self-describe what our API does. And you can also see there's some annotations from Lombok and so on in terms of constructors that we're using there. But this is really a very, very simple plain old Java object, okay? So what we want to do is we want to say, when this is requested, return this. Now, we need to determine a couple of things. We need to decide which HTTP method it's going to respond to. So in this case, we're going to respond to a get method. Okay. By the way, many of these annotations will be familiar if you've already used Java Enterprise. So expect to go, that looks very familiar, and the answer is yes, it is. Much of what you will have learned if you have done Java Enterprise, you can apply directly to this code. Okay, so we need to select a path, in which case this is the path of the method. If we didn't, it would just do a GET request on /store. But for now, we're going to put /stock level. Okay, and we need to say what the type of content it will create is. The reason for this is that Helidon will automatically convert this collection of item details into a text format for us. And we need to tell Helidon what that text format will be. So as this is a REST service, we will use the fairly industry standard for REST services, which is we're going to return this as a JSON set of data. We could have done it using XML, for example, and if we weren't using REST, if we're using, say, a gRPC data format, we could have returned it in a binary gRCP format. So it produces media type. Oops. Dot authentication JSON. There we go. Okay, so now we've only put a couple of annotations on this. It says, if you do a GET on /store/stock level, this piece of code will be called and the return will be formatted in JSON. Okay, so pretty easy. You can see so far we haven't actually done anything to our business logic. All we've done is we've gone and told it to return it. Now, I'm just going to save that file. Now, there are different ways you can register a class as something that Helidon will use when it creates endpoints. By default, Helidon will set this up for you automatically, so you don't actually need to set up anything at all. But because of other features we're going to be using in the lab later on, what we're going to do is, for now, we're just going to set that up manually. So I'm going to have a look at the main method of my stock manager. Okay. And you can see that this basically just creates a server with a configuration. Okay. Now, we will look at that in a little bit more detail later. If we didn't do that, we could just use Helidon itself to create the server for us. So we would, in effect, use a main class within the Helidon environment. But what we do need to do is we do need to say, this is the application of these are the classes that come into it. Now, again, if you don't do this, Helidon can automatically detect this for you. What we're going to do today is we're just going to do this manually. Okay, so we're going to put a couple of annotations on here. We're going to make it application scoped. What that means is there's only one single instance which will get reused every time it's needed. And that reuse is handled by the Helidon framework and the dependency injection subsystems. And we're going to say where it runs on. So as in what URL. So for now, we're just going to put it on the root. So effectively, to get to our list or stock method, it will go /, which comes from the application, and then stock, which comes from the stock level resource, so the storefront resource, and then stock level, which comes from the method. Okay, so we've now effectively defined this. And I say, I'm doing this manually because of other elements that will come later in the class. You can have this done automatically, which means you just don't need to set these things up. Okay, so let's save that. And that's basically it. Let's go and have a look at trying to run that. So if I run the main class, now here we're going to be using just standard interactions rather than, we use CRL, so it doesn't have a web front end or anything like that. So I have told it to run there. You can see in the window at the bottom here that the class is running. It's now up and running, and you can see it's running on localhost 8080. So I am going to run a terminal here. There's a terminal gone, system tools. And we're going to use the standard curl command to actually make the request to the system. So curl -i just gives a little bit more information, but not as much as if it was verbose. We're going to specify the method to use. By default, curl will use get anyway, but it's just good practice to do that because we're going to be using other methods later on. Localhost 8080, oops, let's spell localhost right, 8080 /store/stock level. Okay, and I spelt store wrong. This is the joy of doing a live demo. Come on. Let's just resize that a little bit to make it easier to bring that one back up. Okay, so literally, if assuming you get the path right, obviously, it's pretty easy to REST enable it, as you see. And what we did was a little bit more complex because of certain other features that we're going to investigate later on in the lab. I could literally have said, I don't care about the main routine. I don't care about the defining the application. I'm going to let Helidon scan automatically for all of those annotations. So creating a REST-enabled service that returns data using JSON, really, really easy. Okay, now there are a whole bunch of other things that we will be looking at in the lab later on about how this works and so on. But let's go and actually just finish REST enabling a couple of the small features here. So I'm just going to stop that application running in Eclipse. And we're going to look now at one of the other methods in the class, which is the reserve stock method. Okay, there's some very, very simple business logic here. Basically, what it does is checks to see how much stock you have left, and it will only let you take a minimum number of items. If you try and go below that, it will reject it, okay? I mean, presumably on the grounds that, frankly, taking a single paperclip is a pointless process. So let's put the annotations on here. Now, this is a post method, because basically what we're doing is we're modifying something that already exists. So if you think about the REST structure as being CRUD, create, update, retrieve, and delete. Sorry, create, retrieve, update, delete rather. Post is analogous to the update method. R is obviously for reading and so on. So that's forget method. Put is the create method, and then there's obviously the HTTP delete method itself. So we're going to put this on a separate path. Now, we don't have to have it on a separate path. It could be the same path, and we just differentiate based on the HTTP method, but this is kind of a little bit easier. Okay, so /reserve stock. Okay. Right, and we need, in this case, to provide two bits of information about the data format. We need to tell it what it produces, which is what we talked about before. Produces application JSON. Okay, but you'll notice here that this method has a parameter, an incoming request. So how do we process that? Well, Helidon can also deal with this for us. Again, it's very similar to the way Java Enterprise works. So we need to say that this consumes data of a certain format as well. Okay, and again, in this case, we're just going to use exactly the same media type. So we're going to use JSON for both inbound and outbound data. And what will happen is that the Helidon framework will look at the body of the incoming request. We'll try and create an item request from that, and it will then pass that to this piece of code. The code will run, it'll do whatever the code does, and then it'll return an item details object, and Helidon will again convert that into the spec type specified in produces. Okay, so this is pretty easy stuff, right? So let's go and save this. Now, we can probably expect to see an error when we run this, okay? Sometimes, it's just an example. It's an issue with running a lab. People sometimes forget to stop the existing one before they start the new one, which means you end up with a conflict on ports. But in this case, I did actually force that to stop. If you're doing the lab yourself, then if you hit an error, you just remember to go and stop the previous one and then rerun it. Okay, so that service is now up and running by the looks of it. Yep, there we go. So let's go and run it. First of all, let's go and retrieve the data that we did before. Okay, so yep, that's there, it works. We've got all of that information there. Now let's try, and hopefully I can do this with copy and paste, because otherwise we get to see exactly how bad my typing is. Okay, so that was a curl command, just to show you again. We've told it it's a post method. We've added a header to say the content of this payload is JSON, and we've added some data to say it wants to request 4 items, right? And we've then given it the URL to work on. Okay, and if you have a look at the text here in our log, you can see that it has requested 4 items for us. Okay, that's pretty easy. It's literally as simple as that to go and get that information. So there, if you like, is the quick introduction to how to use Helidon to set up a REST-enabled service. It does a couple of puts and gets and so on. You will have noticed a couple of things here. I did this using annotations. So in this case, we're using Helidon microprofile, which as it starts up, looks at all of those annotations and will do all of the behind the scenes work for us. So we don't have to do that. The other thing is we didn't make any changes to our business logic or to our code even. We just literally added the annotations. Now, obviously, in some situations, you may need to make changes to your code. That's going to depend on the specifics of your environment. But in the vast majority of cases, you can REST enable something by literally doing something as simple as we've done here. And as I said before, we're making changes to the main class, we're making changes to the application level class. You don't actually have to do those if you don't want to. It's just that we're setting things up for a little bit of the lab further on. So for now, thank you for your attention. What we're going to do in the next module is we're going to look at how we would authenticate. Thanks for your time. What you've just seen is based on a lab, which goes through effectively using Helidon to create microservices from a monolith piece of code. This lab is available to anybody on the internet. It's originally written to work in the Oracle Cloud, but you can take the source code from the Git repository and run it in your own environment. You can use a MySQL database or other databases if you want to. So what I'm going to do now is quickly show you how to get to the lab. That will include links to where you can download the original template source code and obviously the content of the lab itself. So in a web browser, if you go to bit.ly/go live labs, okay, and that will take you to the Oracle Live Labs starting page. Then search for using Helidon to create microservices from a monolith. Now that's going to return 2 lab options. The overall sequence of videos is based on the extended lab version, but if you don't want to do the extended stuff, you can just focus on the shorter version. You basically just click the launch button. And then if you want to run it on an Oracle trial, you can register for free trial environment. If you already have a free trial environment, you can then look at running it within that environment. You just basically click on that. You can then have access to the web page. Effectively, what you need to do, follow the instructions under getting started and set up your tenancy and set up for the Helidon labs to get this working in the Oracle Cloud environment. Now, if you don't want to use the Oracle Cloud environment, then there are instructions on how to download the source code using in the setup for Helidon labs section. You'll obviously need to make sure that you've got Java 11 on your laptop. You're going to need to make sure that you've got a suitable IDE and so on. If you want to use a database other than the Oracle database, you can do that, but you'll need to configure the database files so that you can ensure that it will work on the local database, and that's basically through the JDBC and JPA, JTA settings in the meta-inf folder. So thank you for that. Hopefully you will enjoy playing with that, and good luck.